Good evening, viewers, and welcome to another session of Mazungumzo. This is your host, Dr. Gilbert Githere, coming to your homes with this analysis of being and time. Now we're in part 22. We've really gone inside the discussion. As my professor used to say, we're in the deep waters. And, only the swimmers, good surfers can challenge the surf at this level. And we continue part 22. And now we are reaching the explanation of deeper meanings of beings and its entities. Very interesting. The ends and betweens of Dasein are the only ways possible, for this is the only status being of Dasein as care allows. Throwness and being towards death, which are in these two formats, fleeing and anticipation, and they live in unity. This state is called connectedness. This is a state of Dasein as it exists in its everydayness. As care, Dasein is a between. The unity above of fleeing and anticipation is possible because of temporality. At this point, we are going to use the temporality route to try and decipher the connectedness between birth and death. Because this is the area where history happens. Because historicity is formed and develops within the realm of birth and death for Dasein. And as humans, the stretching of Dasein to fill up the birth and death is called historizing, an ontological act. It also has another name, connectedness. Interesting, yeah? Connectedness. The movement of existence is not in the realm of present at hand. This motion is all about stretching. This stretching is called historizing. And this is when the analysis uses ontology in looking at the way Dasein stretches between birth and death. Ontology, existential ontological phenomenology, constitution or constituents. One of it is the stretching. And within that, like a formula which helps us be able to look at temporality between birth and death. And it is going to help us decipher entities and things happening between those 2 points, birth and death. The structure of historizing, especially when using the existential ontological route, allows one to understand ontologically the historicality of Dasein as it relates to birth and death. When Dasein is involved in this act, a movement with some persistence, then we come across Dasein and its ability of constancy of the self. Constancy of self is being of Dasein. This is one of the entities of Dasein. Historizing is a particular temporalizing of temporality, and for this reason, this will give us an to how Dasein stretches itself between its beginning and its end. History can only be studied as an object of histology, and it has to be studied through the prism of temporality. In this route, history becomes being which belongs to the historical, from historicality which is tied to temporality. That's a mouthful right there. You got to really analyze it to understand it. If this is to be looked through this prism of temporality, then the other ingredient to go with this will be phenomenology. History will be analyzed phenomenologically. The existential ontological constitution of historicality will be taking the route the analysis of Dasein has followed throughout this paper. When you look at Dasein through its potentiality for being whole and its quality for having care through temporality, this gives a window to see Dasein's historicality through existence. The existence of Dasein through historicality is also reflected in temporality, being temporalized. It is also important, as we surmise these ideas, it is good to remember that Dasein's historicality is based on scrutiny, care. Dasein by nature is historical. All history is about him. Historicality is tied directly to Dasein's everydayness. Deciphering and discovering are all relating to Dasein's abilities to historize. Dasein exists historically, and for this reason we are to read its history, and as a result of which we are able to know who Dasein is. Our ability to document the history of Dasein using the existential ontological phenomenological route, then it opens a window which allows us to see how it is possible to use science to catch human history. Dasein's connectedness of life to birth and death is not a physical thing, but an abstract thing inherent in Dasein's self. Ontologically, this abstract nature of Dasein, if expressed in present at hand, everything goes wrong with the connectedness of life through birth and death. Dasein does not feel a stretch of life with these momentary actualities. Its being is put up in such a way that it is stretchy, and so abstractly it stretches along or itself to fill in the space between birth and death. All these characteristics of feeling are non-actual. Birth is not something past, and so is death. The fact is that Dasein exists as born. At the same time, it is in a state of dying. This we call being towards death. For Dasein to remain in a state of caring, the birth and death remain at a level or a state of dialectics. In between birth and death is Dasein, and at each end, birth and death. Thoroughness and being towards death form a unity, fleeing or anticipation, which Dasein in a state of care is the in-between link. Dasein as an in-between is care. This is all made possible by temporality. the magic wand of existential ontological phenomenology, constitution of Dasein. That needs to be deciphered. The conditions of Dasein, especially with temporality in play, allow us to be able to decipher the phenomena of the connectedness of life. Movement of consciousness, always and constant, is what Dasein has plenty of. It is not the movement of something, a thing present at hand. It is an abstract motion which Martin called stretching itself or along. This stretching along, Dasein, is referred to as historizing. Also connectedness, which is abstract of survival, which Dasein is involved in, can be called historizing. When one is able to decipher the act of historizing and the existential temporality of Dasein, then one has discovered the historicality of Dasein. This act by Dasein, persistently, of historizing, can be given another name, which is plainly the constancy of the self. This is a way of being of Dasein and is based on temporalizing of temporality. This will force us to look into what makes up temporalizing. Temporality gives us a lot of answers about what is between birth and death. It allows us to see the history involved in this consistency of the self. The answer of the history we are talking about here is not found in the science of history, which takes one to epistemology, study of history as a discipline of the logic of how dates and events of the day make up the history of people. History, as studied as science, history is the object of study in this case. In most cases, the phenomena of history has always been left behind. The history to be studied as an object of histology, Dasein as the object of history, has to be brought in. Dasein is in this case a historical creature. Its historicality through temporality will be looked into. Historicality and primordial through the lens of temporality. For them to produce the best results, they have to be looked through a phenomenology. If this is done, then history will have passed through existential ontological constitution, which is what Dasein has been put through in this analysis. This is like the magic wand, It helps us decipher things. We must put through things through that mixture, that magic wand. It gives us results as we decipher entities which help Dasein to exist. Historicality is supported by some facts that have been deciphered in the existence of Dasein. Even when history is looked at ordinarily and seeing its main points as a discipline. The study of history for the above purposes must be from a primordial angle. Or, without the interference much primordial. Understanding of Dasein historicality through existence has been made possible by the entities who relate to his existence that we have discovered in our previous analysis. Dasein by nature has potentiality for being whole. and its care is all seen through temporality. The facts that have been gathered through this route allows us to see Dasein through historicality. The existence of Dasein through historicality is all directly linked to temporality and ability to temporize. Also, it is important to recapitulate the fact that temporality is a variable of care. Another thing to remember is that Dasein's existence is all historical. Dasein's most important horizon is its trait or characteristic of everydayness. This trait involves deciphering and discovering of entities who are close to it and help it to exist. The above behavior can be called historizing. That is when Dasein is busy revealing and making things clear through understanding. The existence or being of entities historically allows us to see history clearly through the above route. Now that we can see history in the everydayness of Dasein, then it is clear that history is possible through human sciences. This is all possible because of Dasein's being historical in nature. Dasein is historical when we look at him from existential interpretation perspective. We are actually able to see him through history, and we abstain from seeing from the temporal perspective. But it is important to note that historical is an entity of Dasein's being, so it must play a part in its existence. So it must have some aspect in its historiology. Dasein is a creature of time. It has a calendar and a clock in order to track its activities using time. Dasein's being part of nature, it experiences itself through time. Things in nature are said to be experienced within time. All these activities are all related through temporality. This discussion is going to come in at a later time in this analysis. Historical is a variable of time, and within timeness, this is self-evident, but this for now will be set aside to look at Dasein from a primordial perspective. The history we are looking at in this analysis is the one which is primordial in nature and seen through an existential ontological constitution. At times, somebody would say, this thing belongs to history. This statement is a reference to the historical existence of an entity or the existence of an item historically. The above perspective of viewing entities historically is also done from a primordial ontological angle. This analysis is a view of history from two perspectives. One, seeing Dasein as a historical entity, and the other, to view seeing entities from the route of their history. At times, history is viewed from a scientific angle. But this analysis is going to leave out the scientific angle of history. In this analysis, history is being viewed from the past perspective. The entities are not in the present at hand mode. They already have been discovered, but they are there as relics of history. They are no longer in use as equipment of the day. At times, history remains with us as ready to hand. For example, the Greek temples. People interact with the relics of Greek Colosseum and can imagine the gladiators fighting their lives from the lions. At times, history is derivative, takes us from the past, present to the future. In this case, the sum of the entities are what make up the history being discussed. We have 20 minutes. History also entails entities that change with time. For example, the culture of people. The existence of Dasein is what makes the history we are dealing with in this analysis. Its measure is time and events. This history includes others who surround Dasein in its everydayness. At times, the history in question is passed to us from those who came before us. The history being at it in this analysis, Dasein is at the center of it all. He is the subject. He is the historizing character in the scene. Historizing is a change or disappearance of events with time as the factor when it comes to these two activities. How is this historizing related to Dasein? That's a question we're going to pose here. This analysis is going to go into the depth of this issue. How does Dasein become historical? Does he get entangled with events and circumstances as to historize, or is he made up of historizing? Dasein's being makes up the history we are dealing with in this analysis. The only ingredient required for this analysis to make it what it is supposed to be is temporality. The existential analysis of this historicality, the following characteristics of the historicality have to be temporal in behavior. Let us look at antiquities that are stored in the museums. They are all from the past, but they are present at hand in the present. The entities in question due to time, their equipment are way gone. They end up drawing interest unto themselves. Due to this, they become historical in nature. The items in question here are historical and at the same time present at hand. This is due to the fact that they are no longer in use as equipment of the day. Also, if in use, for example, a heirloom, they remain historical for the simple reason that their world as equipment was long way gone and they are living in borrowed time. Dasein by nature is futural. This fact makes it possible for having a state of making present. This is due to Dasein temporalizing temporality. Belonging to the world or being in the world is what allows the formation of history. Similarly, the world has a historical being. This allows Dasein to exist, as a result of which temporality temporalizes, and this allows future to create situations of making present, which also allows history to form. History is usually made up of the past or the state of having been. Dasein is a historical. Similarly, the entities we encounter within the world, especially the equipment or natural things found in the environment, all have a history. The entities found within the world, excluding Dasein, who instead exists in his own right as an entity, are referred to as world historical. The entities found in the world are referred to as world historical. Fact-wise, Dasein has a history. The reason is that he exists, and he is the subject and the character at the center of the events and days that are taking place. It is important for us to point out that Dasein is an entity whose being is recorded in the history of the day. So it has a historicality as its main characteristic. Existence equals historizing, equal Dasein is the historical character. Existence historizes. As it does this it becomes a historical character. Resoluteness means facing being guilty of Dasein, facing finiteness in life. This state creates denial and anxiety in humans. The true name of resoluteness is called anticipatory resoluteness. Resoluteness is the ability of Dasein to practice its potentiality for being. It refuses to see itself as finite, and even if there is an end, it denies its being there. It dwells in a state of denial and puts things behind the back burner and continues to live as if it has no end. The idea of an end is equated with freedom. Dasein believes and lives a life of total freedom, refusing to see finiteness as a state of mind that should bother it. In the existence of Dasein viewed from an ontological prism, the state is entitled by Martin Heidegger when he approaches this issue. What does anticipatory resoluteness give Dasein? For as he exhibits this behavior, he still faces its end. So the big question is, what possibilities accord him against its finiteness? State of defiance against death is what resoluteness gives Dasein, meaning he lives in a full life, enjoying his life to the fullest, not thinking much about the end to come. Will taking over the thrones of the self into its world perhaps disclose a horizon from which existence snatches its factical possibilities away? Is thrones a state of care? This is the state the resoluteness lashes out, a possibility to counter finiteness. For Dasein being in the world is what allows it to be in a state of thrones. This state challenges its potentiality for being. Thrones, other name is there. For in there, Dasein is open to world's tribulations and problems, which in the end mean its end. Thrones is the ability to be among others. Dasein by nature is a social creature. always interacting with its peers. In the they, the self is lost. The possibilities for existence become communal, creating a situation that does not make the individual struggle prominent. They get fuzzy in the crowd of many. Kifo cha wengi ni harusi, Waswahili wasema. But in everydayness of Dasein, there are those fine and tacit moves of possibilities that Dasein exhibits, showing its struggle to survive, the harsh physical and psychological existent obstacles before it. The state of mind resoluteness allows revisits of self, in which is able to talk to self, dialoguing about existence and possibilities involved. You're always discussing with yourself about existence and survival against your end. Is a perpetual thing. Dasein is always in a state of care, which translates to doing good while existing. This is supposed to be Dasein's heritage. The more Dasein unravels its purpose for existence, the more it discovers the reasons and purposes for its existence, and especially when it is put against the fact that Dasein is finite, an end will have to come. Everything becomes real when Dasein puts death into perspective. Nothing is provisional or accidental. Acceptance of finiteness becomes the only option. That's a mouthful right there. In the above milieu, Dasein decides to take options which would allow him some comfort in its existence, avoids those options with suffering and taking things lightly, and this behavior plays fate and tricks. Originally, Dasein has handled its fate, that is finiteness, in the style described above. This is Dasein's practicing its primordial historizing, which includes its existing comfortably, at the same time accommodating the idea that it is finite. Dasein has been exposed as an entity, being in the world. It has fate before it, meaning there are good things and bad things before it. Even the irresolute go through what Dasein. I'll read again. Even the irresolute go through what Dasein. The events and circumstances that form fate have very intricate, abstract being. Dasein, in accepting its fate of finiteness, the free it becomes when it comes to intricacies of its existence. Its lack of control of its fate and willingly accepting its vulnerability, then it gets to control its powerlessness. Existence of Dasein has the ability to historize. That's a good one. But this ability is also a power his neighbors have. This is a communal prowess. Being with one another in the same world and in our resoluteness for definite possibilities. Only in communicating and in struggling does the power of destiny become free. Fate has little to do, especially when it comes to death. It realizes its guilt, original sin. It exposes itself to a danger without fear, and for this reason, it is always in a state of anxiety. Dasein goes through this realm of entities: conscience, death, guilt, freedom, finite. These in total are all a variable of care. At the same time, make up the state of fate. The above collection of entities are the one which allow Dasein to have an existence which creates history as temporality temporizes. Dasein is futural in nature. That means, in its being, as it articulates this mode, it also addresses death, which is constantly staring at him. All this behavior towards death is possible because of Dasein's equiprimordial and futural characteristics. Dasein has the ability to stare death in the face and accept fate. I think at this point, I have done 36 minutes. As usual, I'm going to stop here and say that is enough for today. And we're almost coming now to the really deep mental gymnastics in this analysis. We're in the deep waters. Because now we are almost reaching to get to the definition of time. Being is almost covered in this section, and its history, and the historicality and historizing. So until we meet again, this is your host, Dr. Gilbert Gisharu Githere, saying bye for now. And until we meet again, it's ciao ciao.